Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, madam.
Good morning, ma'am.
Morning, madam.
Morning, everyone. The time is now 10 o'clock and I shall resume this inquiry into the appeal made by Dignity Funerals Limited against the decision of Doncaster Council to refuse planning permission for a crematorium, including memorial gardens, car parking, a new vehicle access onto Green Lane, and ancillary works at land south of Green Lane, Brodsworth, Doncaster. And this is the final day of the inquiry. First, the usual reminders. If everyone can make sure the mobile phones are switched off or on silent. Could the council ensure that the attendance sheet is sent through to the case officer, please? We aim to break around 1 p.m. for lunch and finish, if at all possible, around 3 p.m. With a suitable mid-morning break. We'll have to see how we get on. So just to refresh our minds, the inquiry opened on 12th of October, seems a long time ago now, and sat for 7 days, hearing evidence relating to greenbelt, landscape, need and planning matters. An accompanied site visit was undertaken on the 1st of November with all parties in attendance. Just to check, has everyone got the agenda for today? Thank you. So today we're going to have a roundtable, virtual roundtable session on conditions first, followed by closing submissions of Memoria, the council and the appellant. But before we do, does anyone else wish to speak today who has not already indicated that they wish to do so? Okay. In terms of procedural matters, thank you to the council for the updated position statement on the development plan following the adoption of the Doncaster local plan. Thank you. Presumably the parties have seen this, and just to check, are there any comments on that position statement? No, shake of the head will do. Thank you. I'm aware of the submissions received yesterday in relation to the Grampian condition. I was proposing to deal with that in the conditions section. We'll deal with it up front. So is that acceptable to the parties? Mr. Robson?
Yes, ma'am. I think hopefully it can be quite a short debate. The council's original in principle objection to it was perhaps clouded by memories of evidence being 4, 5, 6 weeks ago. And of course, the plan of the hedgerow improvements was at Appendix G of Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence and was referenced in his evidence, and therefore has been before you and is before you on which to make your decision. So it isn't, as we had put originally, something which has come in at the very last minute. It's something that has been there since the exchange of evidence at the very least. The terms of the condition itself we can discuss in due course, but I don't think there are any issues with the actual wording. The council has some remaining concerns that Mr. Village or his client, who deals with the conditions session, may be able to address about ownership and deliverability of the mitigation. I hope, ma'am, that clarifies the council's position both for you and for Mr. Village and his team in advance of the discussions later this morning.
Okay, thank you. So we'll deal with it up front in case the advocates wish to disappear for the discussion on the conditions themselves. Yeah, apart from that, though, are there any other procedural matters at this point, or sort of from a hangover from previous sessions, Mr. Village?
Yeah, well, I think what I was hearing a few minutes ago was the distinct sound of Mr. Robson crashing through the reverse gears of his client's position in relation to that condition. I mean, we set out in the emails that you would have seen through my instructing solicitors precisely the point that Mr. Robson now points to as the reason why their position in relation to the gramping condition was a palpably bad one. Unfortunately, that hasn't stopped me addressing the point fairly extensively in my closing submission. So it may well be that I will have to revisit those before I deliver them to you. I may have some time to do that this morning. Clearly we welcome the Damascene conversion on that point.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Village. So if there aren't any other procedural matters, we can move on to the round table session on conditions. Okay, just to confirm, I shall start by saying that the discussion on conditions is a standard procedure. It does not indicate that I've made my mind upon the case and does not weaken the Council's continued opposition to the proposal or the appellant's case that planning permission should be granted. So just to make that clear before we get started, presumably the various planning witnesses will be participating in the discussion, as well as perhaps.
So far as we're concerned, Madam, Mr. Williams is going to be taking the strain of this particular part of the inquiry for us, and it may well be that Mr. Jimby chips in as well, my instructing solicitor. But I don't think you're going to hear from me. I would doubt you'd hear from me anyway.
You'll be honing your closing submissions, Mr. Village, no doubt.
Writing them.
You've had quite some time to write them. Mr. Barrett.
Madam, I just wanted to raise one matter because it was my client's instructions to raise one of the conditions, condition number 7 of the draft. It's a short point. Condition, I'll allow everyone a moment just to pick up the relevant condition.
Yes.
And condition as drafted is requires the sight lines shown on a specific plan, which is not controversial in itself, but the condition deals with the position of before the development is brought into use. Madam, our short point is that because of the importance of visibility at that junction and the speeds that have been identified, the need for that condition should also cover the situation at the point of time of construction, because one would expect there will be a degree of construction traffic that should have the benefit of those sight lines as the development progresses, rather than simply leaving it until the moment that the crematorium is brought into use. So our short point is that that should be a true pre-commencement condition in order to maintain the visibility splays which are acknowledged to be needed are provided at the outset.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Robson, would you like to respond to that point? Or bring Ms. Sudders in?
Ma'am, I've got no direct instructions on the point, so I'm not sure I can. I'm in a position to respond. Ms. Sudders is on the call and may wish to turn her camera on.
I mean, alternatively, we can. I was going to discuss the gramping condition first, and then just move through condition by condition. I don't think it'll take too long because there aren't too many points I want to raise on them, so we can consider at that point. Is that acceptable, Mr. Barrett? We'll just work through systematically the conditions in order.
It would be sensible, and that, of course, is the normal practice. One goes through the conditions, but I thought if both counsel, Mr. Village and Mr. Robson, were about to go off screen and mute, if I was going to raise a point, in fairness, I had to raise it before my learned friends.
Yes, I understand, Mr. Barrett. Well, perhaps we shall give the council some time to think about that, and we can always come back to that point at the end of the condition session. Mr. Village?
Well, so the council don't have to think about it too hard. It might help if I just say that I can see the force of what Mr. Barrett says. Of course, I appreciate that Memoria are particularly concerned about highway safety issues, but leaving that aside, it does make sense that the sight lines are provided prior to the construction commencing. So, and we don't have any difficulty about that, if that helps.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Village. Okay. Right, then we shall get started on the conditions. I think my thunder's been stolen somewhat in terms of the gramping condition by Mr. Robson's clarification of the council's position. I was going to ask Mr. Williams if I could have the planning consultants on screen. That would be useful, thank you. And the council's planning officer. Is Mr. Mitra there? Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Yes, in terms of the documents that were introduced, Mr. Williams, obviously there was the kind of photo showing the off-site hedgerow enhancement plan, which I know it wasn't to scale. That's something I was going to raise. Whether a plan, a scaled plan, might be useful. But if you could just briefly introduce the that plan. And explain the title deeds, and presumably your position, Mr. Williams, is that the plan does not represent an amended plan and does not materially alter the scheme. So if the parties are agreed on that point, Mr. Does that seems to be the council's position now, that it's not an amended plan and it doesn't materially alter the scheme. Can I just clarify that first with the parties?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Mitra, is that something that you...
Yes, ma'am, I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. That curtails a discussion. We don't need to go through the Wheatcroft principles on that. So just then turning to the actual gramping condition itself in terms of the wording of that, Mr. Williams, could you just set out for me, sort of introduce the condition and set out how you consider the condition meets the test in the MPPF PPG, and in particular paragraph 21A of the PPG in terms of whether there would be a reasonable prospect of the action being performed within the time limit imposed by the condition. Mr. Williams.
Yes, thank you, Ma'am. So the way we've drafted this condition, it'll allow the local planning authority and the appellant to reach agreement on the specification, the implementation period, and the maintenance arrangements for the enhanced boundary treatment along Green Lane. You'll have seen from the Appendix G to Mr. Kirkpatrick's proof of evidence that we've entered into correspondence with the landowners through their agents, Savills, who've confirmed in correspondence that the appellant has the full cooperation of the landowner to undertake the additional planting And the purpose behind it is to effectively shore up the existing gaps within the hedgerow along that stretch of Green Lane, which no doubt you would have seen from your site visit. We're comfortable that the appellant effectively has control to use to enter the site and to complete those additional planting works. And as such, we do feel that the condition meets the 6 tests for imposing planning conditions, which are set out at paragraph 56 of the framework. In terms of a programme for completing the additional planting, the conditions being drafted so that a timetable is agreed, but on the understanding that the planting will be completed before the crematorium is brought into use. We think that's a reasonable and sensible approach, principally so that the works can be completed within the appropriate months for planting, which generally speaking are the months of November to March, without holding up a start to the development. So on that, on that basis, we've suggested the wording that's before you, and we think it's an appropriate form of wording to deal with that particular issue.
Okay, thank you. I shall open up discussion now in terms of the wording of the condition. Ms. Siders, from the council's point of view, are there any particular issues in terms of the condition itself or how it's worded?
Ma'am, sorry, Ms. Siders has asked me to chip in. So I'm the council's planning solicitor, and I've had some input on the drafting and agreement of the conditions. And I think as we set out in our email to the case officer, we just have some issues around the deliverability of the mitigation in terms of the land ownership. It hasn't really been clarified, I don't think, by Mr. Williams as to how that condition is going to be enforced. As I understand it from the title information provided, there is no control in terms of Dignity having ownership of that land. So I'd just like to understand how exactly they think that condition is going to be enforced.
Mr. Williams, would you like to clarify that point, please?
Well, we've submitted information on the title ownership, so it is we've demonstrated that the relevant title of the land is within the same land ownerships, which is directly related to the appeal site itself. And all I can say is that we have the, as I alluded to earlier, we have the full cooperation of that landowner, that we can go onto site and complete the additional landscape enhancement works.
I mean, Ms. Cutler, in terms of the test of a gramping condition, obviously it has been negatively worded, but the PPG advises that gramping conditions should not be used where there are no prospects at all of the action being performed by the time limit imposed by the condition. I mean, are we in that situation here, Ms. Cutler? What's your view on that?
I don't think it's satisfactory, ma'am, particularly because they may have the consent at the moment of the landowner, but the land is outside the red line boundary of the site. The landowner has just given its sort of written confirmation. It's not particularly satisfactory from an enforcement of a condition perspective, in my view. if the land was in the ownership of Dignity, I'd be much happier about it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Williams.
I'm sorry to butt in. Can I just interrupt here on behalf of Dignity? I'm Ian Jimby of Clyde & Co, their instructing solicitor. I can deal with this quite briefly because I think we've cast it deliberately in a Grampian type form. There's no science behind this. It's a perfectly standard form of condition. You have a letter before you from Savills, who have the express authority of the landowner of the appeal site, who also own this additional land, provided you with the title to demonstrate their ownership of the site, and they've confirmed unequivocally that the landowners accede to these works being carried out on their site. It cannot possibly be said that there is no prospect of these works being carried out per the advice in the PPG. And we would commend this condition to you as a perfectly enforceable Grampian type condition to deal with this type of scenario that comes up, as I'm sure you're aware, Ma'am, routinely on these matters. So I don't think there's anything controversial about this condition. I think it accords entirely with the advice in the PPG and the MPPF about Grampian type conditions.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Cutler, did you want to respond to that?
No, Mum, I think I've made my position on it quite clear. I'm not convinced that it is enforceable, but I leave that to your determination, Mum.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mitra, did you have any comments in terms of the condition?
Thank you, Ma'am. I'm inclined to agree with the council in this particular circumstance. Obviously, the area involved with the additional planting falls outside the red line boundary. It's not identified within a blue line on the application drawings. And while we note that the appellant indicates that it's within the same ownership of the current landowner, it clearly isn't within the ownership of Dignity or under control of Dignity at the present time and at the point, Ma'am, you make your determination on the appeal. So I think the only reasonable prospect in those circumstances and advice is that a Grampian condition be imposed, and we're happy to leave that to your discretion, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, I've heard views on the issue, and I will make a judgment on that in due course. So if there aren't any other representations on that particular matter, just to check before we move on. No. Then we shall move on to the running through the list of conditions. So hopefully this won't take too long. Just bear with me. Oh, just actually in terms of the plan itself, showing the mitigation and the infilling of the hedgerow. Our party is happy that it's effectively sort of a photo as opposed to a scaled plan, just to seek views on that. Are there any concerns that it's not a scaled plan, to put it that way?
I think, Ma'am, the condition requires a detailed planting plan to be provided, so yeah, I would have thought that covers off the points, but that's not for me to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, just moving on to the discussions. If we work the conditions, if we work through them systematically. The first conditions, obviously. Oh, sorry, Mrs. Sidders.
Sorry, Mum. I seem to be having a problem today with the sound. It keeps dropping out, so I'm missing a large part of what you're actually saying. So it would be quite useful if Ms. Cutler could sort of stay on in the conversation, because I'm just missing quite a lot at the moment.
Okay, can I just check that everybody else can hear me okay? Yeah, must have a bit of a connectivity issue there, Mrs. Sidders.
I think it might be. I think it might be.
Can you communicate with Ms. Cutler
Can do, yes.
the virtual? If you do have a burning issue, please put your hand up and we'll see if we can kind of
Yeah,
accommodate you.
will do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right, so the first conditions, time conditions, pretty standard. I may tweak the wording slightly. The second condition, in terms of, is this fairly standard plans condition. Are there any issues in relation to the plans listed in terms of the actual list of plans? I did wonder whether the plan referred to at condition 7, the transport plan could be included in that list. That was just a thought.
I believe it is, Ma'am.
Included.
I believe it is already included. Yeah. So I was going to propose that that one. Oh no, sorry, I'm getting confused with another condition later on. Sorry, I'm referring to condition 9. We'll come to that. Thank you.
Okay. I mean, just for completeness, really, I wondered whether it'd be worth including that drawing number in the list of plans. Fairly minor point, but any other plans that have been missed? Any other comments in terms of that list of plans? That was the only one I picked up that seems not to have been included. I'll assume silence means that you're happy with that. Just a nod of the head will do. Condition 3 in relation to the details of foul, surface water and land drainage systems seemed fine to me. It's got the implementation clause in. Fairly straightforward. Any comments on that? No. In relation to condition 4, I don't think I had any comments on that. Obviously, it's been the reason for it's been linked back to paragraph 174 of the MPPF. Is there a corresponding development plan policy? It's been the new plan.
I think the reference would be policy 30, Ma'am, and we can add that in.
Are there any comments in relation to the wording of the policy? I mean, obviously, the prior to commencement is so that the habitat can be assessed prior to the development commencing, which makes sense. So I didn't really have any other points on that. Nobody else does. The construction environmental management plan, that again seemed fine. The reason relates to the core strategy policy 16. It may be that could be updated. Any other points on condition 5? Oh, whizzing through these. Right, condition 6. In terms of the 30-year management and monitoring plan, my main comment on this is in relation to the length and detail contained within it. I tend to prefer shorter conditions, but what I wondered whether it might be possible to do, rather than include all of the detail as set out there, whether it could be reworded prior to the commencement of development. A 30-year management monitoring plan for proposed on-site habitat shall be submitted to the local planning authority for approval in writing. And that the detail of the management monitoring plan shall be agreed in advance of it being submitted, something along those lines, rather than actually include all of that detail in. I'm happy to take soundings on that, but it struck me as a a fairly useful way of condensing the condition.
I have no issue with that. Yeah, I'm very happy with that from the council's point of view.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on that proposal to condense the condition?
We would be happy with that approach too, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, again, on the reasoning set out with that condition, it might need to be updated.
I think just to save repetition, can we just agree that the policy references should be updated across the board? Thank you. Okay, moving on. In terms of condition 7 and the sight lines, my main comment was that obviously the drawing numbers referenced there. It did take me a while to find that. It may be worth just being included after the drawing number of the transport statement, just so it's clear where that plan is really. Just to save people fishing through all of the evidence, but that was my very minor comment on that one. Are there any other? Is that acceptable to the parties?
Obviously, Ma'am, the comment made by Mr. Barrett earlier on today about being a pre-commencement. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously.
Ma'am, just on the pre-commencement point, just a minor point really, but I think, strictly speaking, those works would comprise implementation of the permission. So it might well be that the trigger might be more happily drafted by reference to prior to construction of works to the building or prior to works to construct the building rather than prior to the development being commenced.
Presumably the road would need to
go
in first though, so rather than the build.
Road work, yeah. Or roadworks, but it might need to tweak the trigger.
Ms. Cutler, in terms
yes,
of
Ma'am. Yes, Ma'am. I agree. I think the trigger may need to be tweaked slightly. Does Mr. Jimby have a particular preference on that?
No, I think if it's referable to above ground works and construction of the access road, I can't think of anything else which would need to be done. But I think that would probably cover it if we cover the access road and above ground works.
How does that sound, Ms. Cutler?
Yeah, I think we can agree to that. Yeah, no problem from this side.
Mr. Williams, Mr. Mitra, anything to add? Are you both happy with that?
No, happy with that, Ma'am. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Condition 8, in terms of secure cycle parking facilities, again, pretty straightforward. Don't have any comments on that. Does anyone else have any? Moving on to condition 9 and parking. Yeah, I was wondering whether it could be strengthened by saying that the parking area shall be retained. Obviously, we say it shall not be used otherwise than for parking private motor vehicles, but maybe for the lifetime of the development, just to make sure it's kept there for so there's no avoidance of doubt on that. Is that acceptable? I've got some heads nodding. Condition 10, I did wonder, given that we have the plans condition, which will show where the buildings are going to be constructed, and obviously the development should be constructed in accordance with the approved plans, and presumably there is no building shown on those plans within 8 metres of the piped watercourse. I did wonder whether that condition was absolutely necessary. Is there going to be a likelihood of any further buildings constructed without prior consent? But yeah, I'm happy to take views on that.
Ma'am, I think as I recall from when I previously discussed this condition with Ms Sudders, this was requested by Yorkshire Water because the location of the watercourse isn't known. Is that correct, Ms Sudders? Or can we agree for that one to go?
Ma'am, yes, this condition can go because the issue was the pipeline was somewhere along the hedgerow to where the access is being proposed. So this was it was a condition that Yorkshire Water suggested just to ensure that there was no development near it, but clearly there is no development near at all, so I'm quite happy for this condition to be removed. Okay.
Any other views on that? I mean, is the watercourse known now? It's known to be along the hedgerow.
No, the exact position isn't known. Yorkshire Water were requiring the applicants to establish where it was in the first instance. I think the appellants have agreed that there would be relocating the drain as a solution, I believe.
Mr. Ginby or Mr. Williams, can you clarify the position on that?
Yes, the precise route and position of that piped watercourse would need to be established through more detailed survey work. Whether it can be left in its existing position will depend mainly on the depth of the pipework. But if it can't be accommodated in its position, then there'll be just a simple sort of lift and shift procedure, which will reroute it. But yes, there'll be no physical development within the 8 metre distance of it.
And have further discussions been sort of taken place, Mr. Williams, with the water company in relation to this? Is their objection outstanding, essentially?
No, it hasn't. There hasn't been, Mum. Those conversations will need to continue.
Okay. So given that there's some doubt over that and the position of the watercourse, then there's more potentially need for that condition, just for the avoidance of doubt. Yeah.
Yeah, we're happy to leave it as it is, Mum. And we'll deal with it and discharge it once those conversations have been completed.
Yeah. Okay. I hadn't appreciated the position wasn't actually known. Any other points on that before we move on? Okay. Condition 11. Again, fairly straightforward in terms of the landscaping scheme. Just to check in terms of the programme of implementation, would that deal with, in the sort of maintenance programme at 6 and 7, would that deal with replacing any trees or plants which die or removed within a certain time period? Is that something that would normally be dealt with through those mechanisms, through the maintenance plan and the implementation plan? Because obviously normally any plants or trees that would die within 5 years is a fairly standard time would normally be replaced. Is that something that parties are happy is covered in the sections 6 and 7?
Ma'am, on behalf of the appellant, we were happy that 6 and 7 covered that scenario. Certainly that's the intention behind those provisions, that they deal both with ongoing maintenance as well, including the need for the replacement of any trees that do not become established. But if it requires further tweaking, we're happy to look at it. But certainly that was our understanding of the intention.
Mum, I thought there was some wording along the lines of, you know, if anything fails to achieve independence in the landscape, it shall be replaced. I'm struggling to find that wording, but I thought it was in there. But if it isn't, then it definitely does need to be, I think, is what we would say on that.
If the intention is that, for example, any tree shrubs which die or become diseased or something like that, then that could be that could be added to 6 at the end, couldn't it? So replace any tree, shrubs or hedging which do not become established, die or become diseased, something like that. Yeah,
I mean, I think it would help to kind of spell it out, really, just in case. Are there any issues with that suggestion from parties? Ms. Cutler?
No issues from us, Mum.
Mr. Maitre?
No, none from me, Mum.
Thank you. The implementation clause states that the agreed scheme shall be implemented in full prior to first use of the development hereby permitted. I was going to suggest that the sort of maintenance aspect of that be included, so maintenance shall be carried out in accordance with the approved scheme, just for belts and braces approach. Are there any objections to that? Nodding of heads, good. Are there any other points on that before we move on? Okay. Condition 12 in relation to tree protection. I don't think I had any comments in relation to that. Any comments on that? Oh, we're doing well today, aren't we? Whizzing through these. Condition 13. I don't necessarily have an issue with the wording of the condition itself. I did wonder, however, whether there is a sort of an associated policy. It's not referred to, whether there's an associated policy to justify going above that required by the building regulations.
Yes, Ma'am, that is in the newly adopted local plan. It's policy 46B, and we can add the reference in when we do our mopping up of amending all of the local plan references.
Okay, thank you. So there's a link to that policy to justify that uplift. Thank you for that. Any other comments on that? No. Condition 14 in relation to BREEAM. Again, pretty straightforward. I didn't have any issues with that. I think again, though, it might be worth just adding in policy reference on that. So moving on to condition 15. Obviously, the condition requires that the surface water runoff be discharged to the public surface water sewer drainage system or highway drain. I just wondered whether sort of sustainable drainage systems have been explored on this site. perhaps the council can clarify on Mr. Williams.
I'll have to defer to Miss Suddies on that one, I think, or if Mr. Williams wants to answer.
I think that's something that Mr. Williams could better respond to.
Yeah, I'd have to refresh my memory exactly what the drainage statement said that went in with the planning application. I think if my memory serves me correct, there will be some. Yes, there'll be obviously water that will be held on site with various attenuation features, but there will eventually be a discharge to a drain at the bottom end of the site, which I think is linked into a culvert that comes underneath the motorway. So, the purpose of that condition is essentially to make sure that there's the provisions there for an interceptor to make sure that there's no oil, petrol, or grit going into that watercourse. So we're happy with the wording of that condition.
Ms. Sudas, presumably the council would normally encourage the provision of sustainable drainage systems as a sort of first port of call.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that? I just wondered to what degree that's been explored with this particular application. It may be something you'd like to come back on to me when you've had a chance to look at the drainage details. Or whether yes. Would there normally be a condition applied saying that details of a sustainable drainage system would be supplied, for example?
Yes, there would, ma'am. It is something that we normally look at as a first option, and there's certainly our drainage team would be looking at as part of the conditions discharge. So it's something that I can get back to you on.
Okay, thank you. It may be that in that case the wording of the condition could be tweaked to reflect that. But if you can have a look at that, the parties can have a look at that and get back to me.
It's probably worth just reminding ourselves that we also have condition 3, which requires us to reach agreement with the council on the surface water drainage system in any event. So the principles of sustainable drainage can be, we'd expect those to be picked up through discharge in that condition.
Yeah. Okay, what's your view, Ms. Cutler, on this cities? Would that cover it?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Condition 12. Hang on. Condition 16. In relation to archaeology, I didn't have any comments on that. Seems fairly straightforward. Are there any points on that particular one? Good. And condition 17, in relation to the details of the electric vehicle charging provision. Presumably there'll be an updated policy on that, policy reference on that. Okay. Right, well, I think we've come in on time on those. Are there any other points in relation to the conditions at this point? Obviously, I'll take a view on whether the grumping condition is justified. but could the parties prepare an updated list of agreed conditions on the basis of what has been discussed this morning and submit that to us?
Ma'am, can I just raise a very quick query with regard to the final condition 17, just for the council really? And I apologise, I think I raised this before in correspondence, but I've forgotten what the answer is. And it refers to air quality technical planning guidance, and just cognizant of being precise, is there a date associated? Is that a document to which there's a date associated with it, in order that we can have clarity as to what we're obliged to comply with when we come to discharge this condition?
Yeah, I remember the query, Mr. Jinby. I think my response was no, there isn't a date, but it's available on the council's website. It is the published document, but it is undated, unhelpfully.
Okay.
Is that something the council could look at?
Yeah, I think we do need to raise it with air quality. So we shall look at doing that, Ma'am.
It might even be helpful to, at the very least, have the specific title of the document quoted in the conditions, so we know exactly which document we're referring to here.
Yeah, I can check the title of it and amend it if it's different to what's said in the condition.
And just to cover the eventuality that may be updated at some point, is it worth just referring to in any subsequent amendment to that document or successor to that document? Okay. Thank you for that. As I say, not too many issues with the conditions, so we've managed to whiz through those, and thank you for your contributions to that. Are there any other points just before we wrap up? No. Brilliant. Just looking at the timing now, it's nearly 11 o'clock, where we were going to be taking a break. If I could have the advocates back, please, just to discuss timings. Mr. Village still writing his closing submissions.
Thank you to Mr. Jinby for keeping my seat warm. Can you see me, right?
We caught you off guard there by finishing early, Mr. Village.
I don't know if it's me, ma'am, but Mr. Village is very much out of focus. I don't know what's happened to the...
Oh, out of focus, isn't it?
A soft focus, Mr. Village.
Never. Actually, I'll use my.
Mr. Village's technical skills are called on again.
Yeah. I knew my mask would be useful for something. No, that doesn't seem to work, does it?
No.
It's still slightly blurry. It's still slightly blurry, but if we could perhaps leave you to resolve that during the...
Well, we can get it done. I'll get the IT people up. It is blurry. Weird.
So as I say, we finished conditions early, and we now have a bird's eye view of you, Mr. Village. We could finish conditions early, which is, you see how much progress can be made without advocates. Gets through things a lot faster.
Road blown.
Apologies. No, just in all seriousness, though, in terms of the timetable, we're due to break at 11 anyway. Mr. Barrett, you're due to give your closing submissions first. Is everyone okay to come back at 11:15?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Right, well, we shall adjourn the thing.
May I just ask you, ma'am, how long does Mr. Barrett, or how many pages, could I ask, are his closing submissions? And same question to Mr. Robson.
It's not a competition, Mr. Village.
No, it's just that it tells me how long they're going to be.
20 pages, Mr. Village, and I would normally take about 30 minutes or thereabouts, 5 minutes either side of that to deliver that speech.
Well, that's talking fast then.
Mr. Robson.
I'm about 5,700 words, which I think is about 45 minutes. In pupillage, I was told that as a northerner, I speak too quickly, which maybe allows me to get through closing submissions perhaps slightly faster than Mr. Village. I don't know if Mr. Barrett suffers from the same affliction.
Well, as a northerner, I think I'd probably talk at the same rate as well.
Oh.
Okay, no, I think you can probably add a bit to Mr. Barrett, and Mr. Robson's probably about right, and I'll be about the same. I'm about sort of 22 pages, 23 pages. So I'll do a little pairing, given that Miss Cuttler's partly revised her views.
Okay, so well within the time estimates provided, so we may finish earlier today. Okay, then. Well, we shall adjourn the inquiry and see you back at 11:15. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome back, everyone. Time's now 11:15 and we shall resume the inquiry. And we shall now move on to closing submissions. Everyone has had plenty of time to prepare the closing submissions, so I'm sure they'll be very well honed and very eloquently written. Mr. Barrett, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I would. Thank you, ma'am. I'm assuming that everybody's received a copy, otherwise I would have heard by now. Ma'am, I begin my paragraph 1, the opening that I submitted at the start of the inquiry, I adopt without any further repetition. Under the heading main issues, I repeat the main issues that were agreed, of course, at the CMC, and I then turn at the bottom of page 1 to that first main issue, the effect of the proposal on the openness and purposes of the Greenbelt. There can't be any doubt as to the extent of the proposal. The appeal site itself extends to 6.3 hectares, and access of some 500 metres in length provides connection to the public highway and to the car park serving the facility. The main building is 743 square metres, and it will comprise a chapel, a crematorium, and an administrative base. It's anticipated that the chapel could accommodate approximately 100 people. The height of the main building is 5.3 metres at its highest point, the chimney 7.17 metres. The eaves and chimney will be pre-painted zinc. 109 car parking spaces will be provided, and the site access road has a direct frontage onto Green Lane. The road falls away from a higher point at the proposed site entrance, 55 metres AOD, to a lower point in a southerly direction, 33 metres AOD. Begin then to look at the landscape assessments, a feature to which Carl Taylor draws attention of the landscape character assessments demonstrates a consistent theme having been identified associated with the character of the area. The national character area that the site falls within is the South Magnesian Limestone NCA number 30, and the key characteristics include smoothly rolling landform, fertile, intensively farmed arable land with large fields bounded by hawthorn hedges, creating a generally large-scale open landscape, a large number of parklands, woodlands and plantations, and historic estates. Within the Statement of Environmental Opportunity, SEO 3 states, and I quote, "Protect the overall rural landscape and maintain its highly tranquil quality, managing the arable landscape to ensure the continued production of quality crops, whilst also enhancing landscape features such as field boundaries and improving biodiversity." Mr. Taylor specifically draws attention to the quotation in the NCA assessment summary, and again I quote, "The farmed landscape also contributes to the tranquility of this NCA and is valued as a contrast to the more urban, industrialised areas to the west and where major road infrastructure crosses the NCA. The parklands, trees and plantations associated with country estates give a well-wooded feel to some areas of the NCA." And Mr. Taylor, in his evidence, in the context of a sense of place, addresses the distinctive, rolling, elevated landform of the limestone ridge. The use of the limestone as a building material reinforces the sense of place. Mr. Taylor and Ms. Oxley consider that particular note should be had to the context of the appeal site in descriptions relating to the tranquility of the rolling agricultural landscape that is well wooded in places. The opportunities aspect of the NCA emphasise the need to maintain this tranquility and to minimise visual impacts from development. Whilst Mr. Taylor recognises that, as with all NCAs in consideration of large areas, the fact that specific reference is made not only to the rolling agricultural and wooded landscape, but also the tranquility of the character, factors of which are apparent on the appeal site description, can be considered to apply to the area of the appeal site and its development. Mr. Taylor assesses the susceptibility to change as medium. The tranquil, wooded and agricultural nature of the open countryside is a factor and is characteristic. More local landscape assessments, then I turn to my paragraph 15. A landscape character and capacity assessment of Doncaster was carried out in 2006-07. The purpose of the assessment was to consider overall landscape capacity to accommodate different types of development. The appeal site fell within LCA C2, Cadeby Adwick Limestone Plateau. A detailed assessment appears in Appendix 3 to Mr. Taylor's evidence. The key characteristics identified were again gently rolling landform, large-scale arable farmland and hedgerows. The general landscape capacity for development, including housing that was being specifically considered, was low. It's perhaps noteworthy that the 2006-07 study referenced spoil heaps associated with the former deep coal mining being typical. In this case, the study area now involves areas reclaimed that now form the Brodsworth community woodland. In this context, Mr. Taylor considers that whilst the susceptibility for the appeal development could be expected to be lower than for large-scale housing and employment development, it is nevertheless medium-high, given the potential for removal of open rural countryside, the introduction of urban elements into a rural area, reduction of tranquility as a consequence, and the potential for loss of and interference with views and openness. The Council, through Golder Associates, more recently in June 2010, produced a landscape character and capacity study. Area EMP 5.1 includes a large proportion of the appeal site. The study specifically considered that the capacity of that area to incorporate employment development. The site was assessed to have medium landscape sensitivity, and Mr. Taylor has assessed that the area including the appeal site should not be appropriately designated a valued landscape within paragraph 174 of the framework. Turning then to landscape effects, the proposed development will see the introduction of built development across a currently open agricultural field with no physical or visual connection to other development areas. It will further involve, firstly, the loss of 180 metres of hedgerow along Green Lane, removed to enable a highway access into the site and the provision of visibility displays. Secondly, this will enable open views over the landscape as it falls away towards Stane Hill Plantation. Thirdly, there is the loss of open farmland to facilitate the road access, car parking and crematorium building. And fourthly, the simple and distinctive rural landscape will be urbanised by the introduction of built form, hard landscaping, designed landscaping associated with these proposals, lighting and general activity. In terms of landscape character, Mr. Taylor's assessment identified the following: loss of open arable farmland, loss of tranquility, urbanising of a disconnected part of the open countryside, introduction of lighting and activity into part of the landscape that is currently without these elements, and the introduction of a designed landscape contrasting with the surrounding simple farm landscape and the landscape at the nearby Brodsworth community woodland. The changes to landscape character type C2 and the key changes will affect changes to a number of key features that I've identified above. The general capacity for development is described as low to none, with even forestry as assessed as moderate, the concern being that this would lead to enclosure and a loss of open views. The wider area is the subject of landscape enhancement and improvement, with the industrial heritage, including the spoil heaps associated with deep coal mining I referred to earlier, having shifted into a phase of regeneration. Mr. Taylor's opinion, excuse me, is that the change is assessed as medium adverse, leading to moderate substantial adverse effect on the character area. These are fundamental changes to the landscape that are irreversible and transformational. Table 1 of Mr. Taylor's evidence sets out his professional assessment. The visual effects are assessed by him at his proof of evidence at page 38 and following. Unsurprisingly, of the 7 viewpoints he has assessed, the largest effects are the receptors along Green Lane, where the introduction of the appeal proposals will be most noticeable. The context is clearly open countryside. There is a dispute as to the extent to which the appeal development would be in views from the Brodsworth community woodland. The changes will be to a tranquil and clearly rural scene through the introduction of urbanising elements. Then the greenbelt. The third purpose of including land within a greenbelt is for safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. As the appeal site is part of the appeal site is within part of the study, Adwick Street 5. Mr. Taylor's Appendix 3 includes the relevant extracts from the Greenbelt study. In the methodology of the assessment, the score was at 3, defined as a general area that contains greenbelt land that is moderately sensitive to encroachment. The review supports the retention of the greenbelt in this area and suggests that a capacity for any development is low to none. Such development would be harmful to the purposes of including land within the greenbelt as well as openness. There will clearly be an adverse landscape and visual effect over the greenbelt that will be an adverse one on the openness of the greenbelt that will represent significant harm to the greenbelt and its openness. The appellant's case I turn to. It's submitted that Mr. Kirkpatrick, on behalf of the appellant, has undervalued the landscape character and visual amenity of the area within which the appeal site lies and understates the impact of the appeal proposal on the receiving landscape. As an overview, Mr. Kirkpatrick maintains, firstly, that the development proposal as a whole does not result in any material harm to landscape character. Secondly, the development proposal as a whole does not result in any material harm to visual amenity. And thirdly, the only harm in greenbelt terms is the definitional harm by reason of it being inappropriate development. Now, in greenbelt terms, therefore, this would represent the lowest conceivable harm that could be occasioned, and it would follow that the very special circumstances needed to clearly outweigh greenbelt and other harm is exclusively limited to definitional harm. In view of the consistent landscape character and visual amenity assessments that have been conducted, this, I would submit, is a startling conclusion. In particular, Mr. Kirkpatrick considers that there is a negligible contribution to visual openness in the greenbelt. Furthermore, at 6.1.9, he regards the views from Green Lane as negligible, notwithstanding the removal of 180 metres of hedgerow. Since he revisited his assessment in the preparation for this appeal, the analysis that was contained within the LVIA has been invariably reduced, and I refer to the relevant paragraphs numbers. In each case, the assessment impact as being low, very low, has been downgraded in his evidence to this inquiry to one that is negligible. Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence in these respects should not be accepted. He has not appropriately assessed the consequences of development and its use, including change to the landscape itself, as once built, views from the site of open fields and plantations will be visible alongside buildings, parking areas and formal landscaping, etc. At 7.1.13 of Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence, it is asserted that the experience of visual openness of the greenbelt would in fact be enhanced by reason of the development. In our submission, this is an argument that is logically inconsistent. The construction of a road, car park and building in a location devoid of any development that people then visit and by visiting hope to experience visual openness enhanced is inherently illogical. By this logic, the construction of a multi-storey apartment building would enhance the openness of the greenbelt by reason of the ability of the occupants of those apartments being able to look out over the greenbelt. Second main issue, whether or not there is an identified quantitative and/or qualitative need for the development. Begin by a brief introduction. Notwithstanding the fact that the Barnaby Dunn planning application was submitted some 3 months before the appeal scheme, at the time of the formulation of the appellant's planning application, the Memoria development at Barnaby Dunn was not known of. Consequently, the assessment of needs submitted with the original planning application took no account of the Memoria proposal and its potential impact on both quantitative and qualitative need for a new crematorium at Brodsworth North Doncaster. Turning to qualitative need, the Memoria Barnaby Dunn development is seen as a commitment. No party to this appeal suggests that the development will not be put into operation. The Memoria scheme represents a modern, state-of-the-art crematorium facility. In qualitative terms, it is indistinguishable from the case made for the appeal proposal. And thirdly, it is located some 10 kilometres 6 miles from the appeal site. As a consequence of the Memoria scheme becoming operational, the capacity pressure at Rose Hill that formed a significant element of the appeal proposal's need case will be significantly reduced. This is acknowledged by the appellants as the new crematorium will meet a need to reduce operating levels at Rose Hill and should enable the quality at Rose Hill to be improved. It follows that there can be expected to be a consequential qualitative improvement in the offer of the existing Rose Hill facility. The Memoria scheme will improve choice and competition in the Doncaster area. Furthermore, with the introduction of the Memoria scheme, the case that local crematoria are old and outdated cannot credibly be maintained. Memoria recognised that the Western Arc sites have qualitative issues arising from capacity pressure. The appeal site, however, is unlikely to contribute to any significant relief to the communities served by the Western Arc crematoria because they are outside of the 30-minute drive time of their catchments. Then briefly turn to the Competition and Markets Authority report of December 2020. My clients consider some useful guidance relevant to the determination of the current appeal can be derived from the CMA final report. The importance of qualitative factors was addressed. In its conclusions on how crematoria compete, the report concluded, and again I quote, "Local proximity and familiarity are important to customers in choosing a crematorium. The decision-making process for customers in choosing a crematorium therefore appears to be relatively straightforward. The large majority of customers use the closest crematorium or one they are familiar with and do not compare alternatives." The observation in relation to the newer built private crematoria is, we submit, particularly relevant. Private crematoria, which are typically newer than their local authority rivals, are able to differentiate themselves through their newer buildings, facilities and grounds, and attract a proportion of customers for whom these factors could be important and may have otherwise used a closer local authority alternative. Although some smaller funeral directors and rival crematorium operators have noted the lack of investment at some of the private crematoria. Based on our analysis, that's the CMA analysis, the proportion of customers that private crematoria may be able to attract from further afield based on a superior offering compared with the local authority crematoria is, on average, relatively limited and lower than the 3 largest private crematorium operators have argued. The CMA, end quote, the CMA analysis and summary of the evidence in relation to out-of-area customers notes that out-of-area customers are those that would have a closer alternative. Paragraph 6.146, page 296 of the CMA report states, and quite long quotes, we refer to them in cross-examination, but if with your leave, I'll continue to read them. We have assessed for each type of crematorium operator the proportion of their customers that use the crematoria but have a closer alternative. We have found that a material proportion of customers at both private and local authority crematoria are from out of area, which indicates that not all out of area customers at private crematoria are customers who choose a private crematorium because of any superior offering or better value for money relative to the customer's closest alternative. It is also relevant that flows occur in both directions between local authority and private crematoria and between crematoria of the same type. Based on our findings, we consider that the proportion of private crematoria customers that choose private crematoria on the basis of price or quality and may be considered to be marginal is relatively limited and lower than the proportions indicated by Dignity, Westerly and Memoria. We note that this conclusion is consistent with our findings from the market investigation survey that 15% of customers across all crematoria choose a crematoria which was not their closest, and that this decision was often unrelated to price or quality factors. And it continued at paragraph 6.147. We have found that across crematorium operators, there is a high degree of variation in the proportion of customers that they attract from out of area. The evidence shows that there are a range of geographical and local factors unrelated to competition that mean people may not use their closest crematorium and can drive these variations. We have found that the proportions of out of area customers at private crematoria increase as slot lengths are longer and fees are lower, but these relationships are not strong. The proportions of private crematoria customers who are from out of area varies widely, and this is the case regardless of whether the nearest rival is a local authority crematorium or another private crematorium. In view of the arguments that private crematoria have put forward about their quality being higher than that of local authority crematoria, we might expect that private crematoria may attract higher proportions of out of area customers when their nearest rival is a local authority crematorium. However, we do not find this to be the case. End of quote. In the context of the planning process, the CMA report specifically addressed whether planning decisions in England and Wales had defined the level of quantitative and qualitative need, which provided should show as part of their planning application. Quantitative need was considered to be the number of people who will be closer to the new crematorium compared with any other. Recent appeal decisions defined an area to have quantitative need, where there will be 136,000 to 171,000 people for whom the new crematorium will be their closest facility. Memoria have calculated in this particular case, the site would achieve 120,670. In terms of qualitative need, the CMA analysis at 4.65 on page 146 describes this as typically the number of people who will now have less than 30-minute cortege drive time to the crematorium. It continued that the recent decisions have considered that a qualitative need exists where there will be something between 59,000 and 95,000 people who will, for the first time, have a crematorium within a 30-minute cortege drive time. This can be contrasted with the appeal proposal, where the level is only 21,493 people that will, for the first time, have a crematorium within a 30-minute cortege drive time. And in this regard, it's interesting to note that the recent Oxted appeal, reproduced at Mr. Bett's rebuttal proof of evidence, identified the number brought within a 30-minute cortege time for the first time, in that particular case, to be 122,000. That is 6 times that of the appeal proposal. This figure was accepted by Mr. Best in cross-examination. Quantitative need. As already indicated, the appeal application was the first in time of the 3 applications which were submitted to the council and determined at the same committee meeting in December 2020. In the submitted need assessment, the appellant didn't make a case that there was in fact a need for 2 further crematoria. The approach of both the appellant and Memoria starts from an assessment of the appropriate catchment for the new facility. The expression used by Memoria for this exercise is minimum distance catchment, whereas the appellant uses what it regards as the natural development catchment. But for all intents and purposes, these are the same, being based upon the 30-minute cortege drive time to the new crematorium. An initial area of dispute relates to the accuracy of the software used by both parties to assess the 30-minute cortege drive time. Mr. Hodgson, in his examination in chief, explained the difference. Memoria used MapInfo that provides speeds for the 36 different road profiles from the Department of Transport. Appendix A to Mr. Hodgson's evidence sets out the travel speeds that are derived from the use of this model. It is open and transparent and can be replicated. This is in contrast to the appellant's approach. The use of Google Maps and others will reroute, but is only realistic for a journey at the time assessed. It is not capable of being replicated. In Mr. Best's rebuttal, table 6.2 in the proof of evidence information, is provided by the AA, useful only at the time of it being used. Table 6.2 does not specify travel speeds inputted into the ArcGIS system used by the appellants. The appellant's model requires manual input to generate the catchment areas. That has not been provided in evidence. Indicating AA travel time information is, we submit, too simplistic for the exercise being undertaken, as the AA is simply a snapshot in time, reflecting the circumstances of the immediate analysis. The most significant difference that explains the disparities between the Memoria and appellant's assessment relates to the methodology subsequently deployed by Mr. Best in his assessment. This is said to follow the Essington appeal decision. In short, the new crematorium takes 100% of the NDC-MDC catchment, plus a further percentage beyond the catchment, essentially to reflect qualitative factors. Well, firstly, that is a view that's not shared by the CMA, who deployed evidence that clearly shows that irrespective of the age of the facility, flows were, quote, both ways. Secondly, there can be no logical basis, and certainly no empirical evidence has been provided to support the appellant's case for an additional tranche of a catchment to be drawn to a new crematorium. Mr. Hodgson pointed out that exactly the same information that Memoria had used in its assessment of their Barnby Dunn proposal was used in its assessment of the appeal proposal. It was used uncritically in the assessment by the local planning authority in determining the application and is self-evidently transparent. In our submission, the approach of Mr. Hodgson should be preferred in the assessment of quantitative need. The MDCs without the appeal scheme appear on map 1.1 and with the appeal scheme, map 2.2. Within the MDC, the population is 120,000 or just over that, which Mr. Hodgson notes falls below any previously consented scheme within open countryside. That is open countryside, not the defined green belt. The assessment of the impact on the Western Arc crematoria is Pontefract 8.7%, Barnsley 5.2% and Rotherham 3.3%. The greatest impact will be on Rose Hill by reducing its MDC by over 56,000. As appears from table 3.5, there is very little support for the appellant's case at this appeal that the level of cremations diverted from the Western Arc crematoria would be significant. Mr. Hodgson's table 3.5 and 3.6 represent the rebalancing exercise following the introduction of the appeal scheme. The appeal scheme is located on the edge of urban Doncaster and is significantly further away from the centres of population currently served by the crematoria at Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham. This can be seen in map 5.1 in the evidence of Mr. Hodgson at page 12. The suggestion that the appeal scheme is well located to reduce pressure on Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham is misplaced. the centres of population lie to the west of the crematorium, this would be significantly outside of the 30-minute cortege drive catchment. In his analysis of the number of people currently living over 30 minutes away from a crematorium, but within 30 minutes of the appeal site, the evidence of Mr. Hodgson, the figure is for 2021, 21,493, and for 2033, 22,611. Again, it will be observed that this level is significantly below that identified in the CMA report in its assessment of qualitative need cases put to the planning process. Capacity analysis. It's part of the appellant's analysis to focus on peak month factors in a capacity analysis. Essentially, the appellant scheme is put forward as reducing pressure on Barnsley and Rose Hill that were overtrading. Practical capacity is closely linked to qualitative need because of it being based around a facility's ability to provide an acceptable level of service. The case of the Rule 6 party is that, firstly, one should exclude direct cremations as they have no impact on the availability of service times or quality of service for people attending a funeral. Secondly, the number of direct cremations is increasing, and it is a trend that is likely to accelerate. Memoria have factored in an 11.52% direct cremation assumption for 2021. This is consistent with the published current rate declared within the funeral industry. Conservatively, the Memoria experience of direct cremations shows significant growth, such that cremations at the Memoria facilities, as at 2021, this is direct cremations, the percentage is some 28%. The calculation for 2033 assumes a figure of 20% direct cremations. This is below the actual experience of Memoria in 2021 and appears to be entirely consistent with the advertising spend of the appellants themselves. The practical capacity without the appeal scheme based on 2021 projections shows that Barnby, Dunn and Rose Hill are operating below 80% of the level of practical core capacity during a peak month. The position at Barnsley is 97.2, Pontefract 109.8 and Rotherham 113.3. The introduction of the appeal scheme in 2021 appears in the table on the top of page 18 of Mr. Hodgson's evidence. Barnby, Dunn and Rose Hill are below 60% of the level of practical core capacity during a peak month. The impact on Barnsley reduces the level of practical core capacity during a peak month to 92.2, Pontefract 99.9 and Rotherham 109.6. The inevitable conclusion from the above is that the critical qualitative threshold emphasised and relied upon by the appellants at 80% is not achieved in respect of any of the Western Ark crematorium. Turning then to the relief afforded by the introduction of the appeal scheme, we suggest this simply supports further the proposition advanced by Mr. Hodgson that the appeal scheme is inappropriately located to significantly reduce any capacity pressure at the Western Ark crematoria. The objective evidence is that it will not reduce pressure at the Western Ark crematoria, such as to make any significant difference to the overtrading issue that is a significant part of the appellant's qualitative and quantitative case to justify the development. In 2021, the Western Ark crematoria at Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham will not be significantly impacted because the level of practical core capacity will all remain above 80% and significantly so. And the level of practical core capacity peak month ranges between 92 and 109% as set out above. It's clear that the largest impact, and by a significant factor, would be on Rose Hill, that would have an impact of over 23% created by the appeal site development. Indeed, it can be noted from the table at the bottom of page 16 of Mr. Hodgson's evidence that following the development at Barnby Dunn, the level of practical core capacity during a peak month at Rose Hill is below 80%, 74.9, and these calculations were not challenged by the appellant. Then turn finally to the context of the appeal determination. Section 38(6) of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act requires that the determination of the appeal application should be in accordance with the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. Policy 1 of the adopted local plan at subparagraph 6 confirms that the openness and permanence of the green belt will be preserved. The statutory development plan is the recently adopted Doncaster local plan. The proposal is contrary to the Greenbelt policies contained within it, and it follows that to determine the application in accordance with the development plan means that the appeal application's starting point is one of refusal. The local plan was adopted following an examination in public at which an independent inspector assessed the soundness of the local plan and its consistency with national policy. The adoption following that process inevitably means that the local plan should attract full statutory weight. Indeed, there would be no basis for giving the adopted local plan any element of reduced weight. In terms of other material considerations, plainly the framework is one such material consideration of considerable weight. All the parties agree that the development proposal is inappropriate development and by definition harmful to the Greenbelt. Again, the starting point would be one of refusal unless the appellants, the burden being upon them, establish very special circumstances that clearly outweigh such harm. And ma'am, I then quote paragraph 148 of the framework, paragraph I'm sure you're entirely familiar with, I won't read it out. It is the submission, my paragraph 80 of the Rule 6 party memoria, that this involves the decision maker going through a process analogous to an algorithm to determine the outcome of the paragraph 148 analysis. In this particular case, cross-examination of Mr. Kirkpatrick put forward a number of propositions with which he agreed. He considered that the development proposal as a whole does not result in any material harm to landscape character. The development proposal does not result in any material harm to visual amenity. The only harm is the definitional harm by reason of it being inappropriate development. It follows that from a green belt standpoint, this would represent the lowest conceivable harm and therefore a very low bar that has been set by the appellants in terms of the harm they must overcome with the demonstration of very special circumstances. Memoria's case, in short, identifies the harm to be considered in paragraph 148 terms, including definitional harm because of inappropriateness, other greenbelt harm, harm to purposes. The development represents encroachment into the open countryside. The appeal proposal is unequivocal built form, and the associated metalled roadway and access. Landform changes are urban in character. There is harm to openness, an essential characteristic of the greenbelt. Openness in this context is both a visual and spatial component. The spatial component is an absence of built form, and there is undoubted harm to spatial openness in this case. Mr. Taylor, in his evidence, addresses the visual openness. Landscape character harm has been consistently recognised through relevant landscape character assessments that the appeal site is part of a rolling rural landscape, open and tranquil. The development will cause harm to the landscape character in the area. There will be some harm to visual amenity, local views from the nearby country park and Green Lane. Whilst Mr. Taylor didn't overemphasise this, they are placed in the balance as obvious disbenefits. Having established the harm as a whole, the decision maker must then identify the appellant's very special circumstances case. Here the case is almost exclusively a need case. This can be briefly summarised as the appellant case maintains that notwithstanding the approval of Barnby Done, there is a compelling need case in both quantitative and qualitative terms for the approval of a further crematorium at the appeal site. Memoria maintain that the need case is overstated. See Mr. Hodgson's evidence. The appellant maintains that there is an additional benefit in economic and environmental terms. The appellant and Memoria are apart on both principal issues, harm and need. These are the issues it is submitted that must be grappled with, assessed and a view taken in respect of the cases put. Memoria's case is that the harm case has been unacceptably minimised and the need case overplayed. Once the decision maker has assessed the harm and assessed the very special circumstances need case, the question then is whether the very special circumstances case clearly outweighs the harm. A finely balanced decision is not enough. The policy requires that the very special circumstances must clearly outweigh the identified harms. What is clear is that there is an obvious conflict with this policy. In the evidence of Mr. Mitra, which we should all note has gone unchallenged or substantial and challenged by the appellant, applied the relevant sections of the guidance. Mr. Mitra's analysis in this context identifies two aspects of openness, the spatial and visual component, and both need consideration. In terms of the duration of the development, it's unquestionably permanent and in realistic terms is incapable of being remediated. This is not a proposal which anticipates the development will be required by condition or otherwise to be returned to its original state once the use of the crematorium has ceased, and the level of activity likely to be generated, such as traffic generation. And Madam, as a footnote there, my footnote 41, I set out the traffic movements that were assessed and the parking requirement that were assessed in the appellant's own transport assessment. Mr. Mitra in his evidence sets out the Memoria case. There is insufficient unmet quantitative and qualitative need to justify the development in open countryside, let alone to that amounting to very special circumstances required to permit development in the Greenbelt. The catchment of the appeal site equates to only 120,000 plus, which falls below any of the previously consented schemes within open countryside. The appeal site is in the wrong location to address any capacity issues in the Western Arc. The appeal site scheme only sits within the 30-minute course and close to the edge of the 30-minute catchment for Barnby Dun, Barnsley and Pontefract. There is not a sufficient population that currently reside over 30 minutes away from their nearest crematorium that would be located within that 30 minutes if the appeal site were developed. Mr. Hodgson provides the figures of 21,500 in 2021 and 22,600 and odd in 2033. And these figures again were unchallenged. Memoria has factored in the likely capacity usage of all the surrounding crematoria in the area with Barnby Dun constructed. This represents an extremely robust repositioning. It demonstrates that Rose Hill is performing comfortably under capacity once Barnby Dun is operational, even based on the peak month calculations. The appeal site has a significant impact on Rose Hill crematoria, excuse me, further reducing its peak month core capacity usage by 23%. There is a far lower impact on the Western Arc crematoria, Barnsley 5%, Rotherham 4% and Pontefract 10%. These Western Arc facilities remain trading at over 80% on core and peak month capacity, even if the appeal scheme goes ahead. And whilst Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham still have some qualitative need resulting from the older offerings and existing capacity pressure, the appeal site, quite frankly, is located outside of a 30-minute cortege drive time from those facilities to help support them. My conclusion, therefore, which we invite you to make is that you ought to dismiss the current appeal. And ma'am, unless I can assist you further, those are my submissions. And I thank Mr. Village for a much more accurate time estimate of my closing than I gave.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. You can breathe now. Okay, Mr. Robson, are you in a position to commence your closing submissions?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, I hope you've had a copy forwarded to you by your case officer, and Mr. Barrett and Mr. Village should have copies as well. If they don't already, it should be winging its way over at the moment. Ma'am, this is an application for a crematorium on a 6.3 hectare site in the Greenbelt, with some form of development, as I will set out later, covering much of that large area. Because it is a major development in the Greenbelt, the appellant agrees that it must demonstrate very special circumstances in order that consent be granted. This means that in accordance with paragraph 148, consent should only be granted if the inspector concludes that the benefits of the scheme clearly outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt and any other harms. This is a test that is not easily passed. In the case of crematorium development, as here, The debate is more often than not about the extent of need and what contribution the proposal will make to meeting that need. It is important that this is a two-stage approach, as Mr. Williams accepted in cross-examination. Those two stages are to identify the need and then to assess the proposal's ability to meet it, including being in the best available location. It is only upon consideration of these two stages that the appropriate amount of weight can be attached to the need argument. It is not a case, as it may have appeared from the appellant's evidence, that one must only establish a geographic need, and that is sufficient to, on its own, tip the balance to very special circumstances. Sorry, ma'am, I cite there the Orchard Barn London Road decision where there was a significant need, but VSC was found not to have been established. Establishing need does not automatically result in VSC and a consent. It is agreed that quantitative and qualitative need are capable of amounting to VSC, but that still relies on the weight that meeting that need generates. Fundamentally, ma'am, it is a matter of weight and judgment. The weight that must be given to the Greenbelt harms is set down in policy, and the weight that should be given to the additional harms caused by this scheme is, we say, clear. On the other side of the balance, the weight to the benefits of the scheme is not sufficient to clearly outweigh those harms. Starting with the harms to the Greenbelt, it is agreed that the development is inappropriate development in the Greenbelt and that it is by definition harmful to it. It is further agreed that the scheme would conflict with the Greenbelt purpose of encroachment into the countryside. These harms, we are directed by the framework and as agreed with Mr. Williams, should each be given substantial weight. With regard to openness, the Council and Rule 6 party presented clear evidence that the proposed development would have a significant detrimental impact on the spatial and visual elements of openness. Mr. Kirkpatrick agreed that there would be an impact on the spatial element of openness, but was less clear in his evidence on the visual component. In his examination in chief, Mr. Kirkpatrick stated that the development would have no material harm to the visual openness of the Greenbelt. As with much of Mr. Kirkpatrick's evidence, this was a conclusion that was not based upon any sound analysis, or indeed on any analysis at all. Mr. Kirkpatrick did agree that there is a degree of overlap between the assessment of impact and on the visual element of openness and the traditional assessment of visual impact as part of an LVIA. His case appeared to be solely based on the fact that the area of the site where the crematorium building is to be built is lower than the other parts of the site. Conveniently for his case, he accepted that he carried out no detailed assessment of the following: the access road, the car park, the removal of 180 metres of hedgerow, the landscaping and retaining wall structures, the memorial gardens and proposed water body, the network of paths within the memorial gardens and the lake or pond. This is a significant amount of development, the visual impact of which and the landscape effects, as I will turn to, were barely assessed by Mr. Kirkpatrick. Whilst some aspects were mentioned, specific, accurate and quantified information about the effects of each aspect of the development was thin. Discussion during the inquiry and site visit about the length of hedgerow to be removed, retaining walls and earthworks proposed, made the omission of specific assessment of all aspects of the development all the more apparent. The extent of this work is plain to see from the spatial programming plan in figure 11 of the DAS, the landscape plans and the levels plan. It is totally inadequate to assess the impact of this development on the visual openness of the Greenbelt without considering the effects of all parts of the proposal. What assessment Mr. Kirkpatrick did undertake was all downgraded by the time he submitted his proof. Despite the design not changing between submission of the application and the appeal, and the receiving landscape remaining the same, Mr. Kirkpatrick downgraded his assessment of visual impact of the scheme downwards for the appeal. He has sought through his evidence to artificially reduce the effect of this scheme on the Greenbelt, whether through failure to visit key receptors at Brodsworth Hall and Gardens, or through downgrading assessment when there has been no change in what is being assessed. Neither did he pick up on additional visual receptors in Long Plantation. With the establishment of a new business there, one would have expected material presented to the inquiry to make additional assessments, as the councils did, rather than simply to downgrade previous assessment. Unsurprising then that his evidence is that the harm to the Greenbelt is the lowest that there conceivably could be, and ma'am, that was the point Mr. Barrett raised in his closing as well. His evidence is partial, lacks objectivity, and fails to show his working. The evidence of Ms Oxley and Mr Taylor must be preferred. It is clear from the plans, and will no doubt have been apparent from the site visit, that this development will have a significant negative effect on the visual openness of the greenbelt. The site, and in particular the access road, will be visible from Brodsworth Hall and Gardens. It will also be seen from the north and northwest from Green Lane and parts of Brodsworth Community Woodlands above. The west from Church Lane, the south from land north of Barnsley Road, that should be, the east from the eastern Long Plantation, and from the fields local to the site, including that of which the site is a part. From the east, the development will be visible to the users of the meditation business in Jackdaw Wood. Cyclists, horse riders and drivers will have a clear view into the site from Green Lane as the 180-metre hedgerow is removed and the new access is created. The access road will have an average of 64 vehicles per hour as one funeral leaves and the other arrives. This introduction of significant movement and lighting during darkness will have a negative visual impact on an otherwise tranquil landscape. Despite not having undertaken the assessment of this impact in his written evidence, Mr Kirkpatrick did accept that it should form a part of the assessment of landscape and visual effects. A detailed assessment of the visual impacts is set out in the evidence of Ms Oxley at the paragraphs there referred. Ma'am, you will be able to come to a view on the visual impacts of the development from the evidence on the site visit. The absence of photo montages, despite the request from the LPA at the pre-app stage, does nothing to assist you, ma'am. Drawing it together, the proposal is harmful to the greenbelt by reason of inappropriateness. It harms the visual and spatial elements of openness. It conflicts with the two essential characteristics of the greenbelt and one of the 5 purposes. In accordance with paragraph 148, substantial weight should be given to each of these harms. The point agreed with Mr Williams in cross-examination. So I should be clear, and this is my drafting. Mr Williams agreed with the point about substantial weight given to each of these harms. I'm not suggesting for Mr Village's purposes that Mr Williams agreed that all of those harms were on site. Of course, planning judgment is not a mathematical exercise. However, it makes logical sense that a development that causes as much harm to the greenbelt as this development must receive more negative weight than one that causes less harm to the greenbelt. You, ma'am, must then assess what other land use planning harm results from this development. Key to that is the impact on the landscape, both physical elements and landscape character. Once again, Mr Kirkpatrick sought to defend his rather far-fetched conclusion that there would be no landscape or visual harm resulting from this development. Again, for the reasons already given, little weight should be given to his views. As Ms Oxley made clear in her evidence and Mr Taylor in his, assessing landscape effect is distinct from visual impact. As Mr Kirkpatrick eventually accepted in cross-examination, although again not in his written evidence, the effects on the landscape are not dependent on visibility. A concession from Mr Kirkpatrick, which stands largely at odds with his written evidence, where he focused his limited assessment of landscape harms, as with his visual assessment, on the location of the crematorium building in the dip. Once again, he ignored the rest of the significant amounts of development, contrary to the guidance in Glivia, which defines development as any proposal that results in a change to the landscape and/or visual environment. Clearly, the many other aspects of this proposal, not just the building in the dip, fall to be considered for their landscape and visual effects. As is well understood, the assessment of landscape, as with visual impact, should be of the whole scheme. It is not correct to focus on only one element of the development. Therefore, you must consider the landscape and visual effects of the whole development, including the 2-lane width access road, the buildings with chimney, the car park and gardens and associated landscaping, the retaining walls and earthworks. What is plain is that the development is not a good landscape fit, as Mr Kirkpatrick repeatedly claimed in evidence. You must also consider, ma'am, the landscape and visual effects that arise during construction, although not explained by Mr Kirkpatrick, including 180 metres of hedgerow removal, substantial earthworks and excavation of the underlying limestone, and the machinery and activity required on site to undertake the work. That's something that Mr Kirkpatrick gave little assistance to you in this regard. The site exhibits a number of important landscape characteristics. These were set down in florid detail in Mr Kirkpatrick's proof at paragraph 4.5.2. The important baseline characteristics were agreed, I think, between all parties as being a smoothly rolling landform that rises from the east to west, a large-scale arable fields, boundary hedges and tranquility. Many of these characteristics are reflective of those in the LCAC2 in which the site sits. It is against this agreed baseline that the landscape impacts should be judged. Unfortunately, Mr. Kirkpatrick didn't then go on to assess in his proof of evidence the impact against that baseline. The capacity of this site has been considered before. The Golders 2010 Doncaster Landscape Character and Capacity Study considered the capacity of various landscape for employment sites, and the document states that this parcel of land encompassing the site forms a locally recognised rural landscape with a distinctive sense of place. Development within the surrounding open agricultural fields would be out of scale and context with the surrounding landscape. Mr. Kirkpatrick stood alone when concluding that the site does have a capacity for development. Whilst the application was judged against the core strategy policy CS3, it is policy 33 in the newly adopted plan that applies now. Policy 33 deals with landscape and requires that the development conserves, enhances, and where possible, restores the landscape character of the area. Alongside this policy requirement, the guidance in the LCAC2 is to conserve and enhance the area, and this site fails to do that. The development will cause permanent and irreversible change to the site. The scheme will fragment an otherwise large-scale arable field which lacks enclosure and is notably completely open to the east, with no hedgerow or woodland along the site boundary, and which is seen in long views from the west of the A1M. 180 metres of hedgerow will be removed, breaking up the existing hedgerow pattern and opening up views from Green Lane. Whilst a new hedge will be planted, it will take many years for this to replace the mature and established landscape feature which will be removed. The tranquility of the site and surrounding area will be broken up by a large car park, frequent and numerous car movements during opening hours, associated lighting, a large access road winding up to the highest and most visible point of the site, earthworks and retaining structures, and a lake or a pond, neither of which are features of this landscape, and non-native and not locally typical planting. The use of land, which Mr. Kirkpatrick agrees is part of the landscape character, will change from an intact rural agricultural landscape framed by the locally distinctive features of Stane Hill and Stane Hill Plantation to the west, to a crematorium set on a levelled platform bound by a long retaining wall with a significant quantum of built development, internal access roads and car parking set within a partly ornamental landscape. The detailed landscape and visual evidence from Ms. Oxley went largely unchallenged during cross-examination. Instead, the focus of the questioning was on the less detailed review of the three schemes prepared by others, the three schemes, of course, being those at application, ma'am. As Ms. Oxley rightly noted in re-examination, ma'am, if you want her detailed expert opinion on the appeal scheme, that is to be found in her proof of evidence and not in the work of others. Overall, the development results in the following landscape effects at the site: an LLCA1 level, a major adverse at construction, moderate adverse at year 1, remaining at moderate adverse at year 10, and a moderate adverse in construction in year 1, with this effect reducing to slight after year 10. In visual terms, the development would result in up to moderate adverse effects, reducing to slight adverse in year 10, although it is important to remember that these differ across the range of identified visual receptors. This is a scheme that is harmful in landscape and visual terms, and that must be weighed into the greenbelt balance, as I will set out in due course. Set against the landscape and visual harm and the numerous harms to the greenbelt is the need for this development, and importantly, whether this site best meets it. At the time of the original application for this scheme, the council was faced with two other applications for crematorium development. The three original applications, including the appeal scheme, were put on the basis of relieving the overcapacity at Rose Hill Crematorium in Doncaster. At the point of considering the three applications, it was the council's view that developing Barnby Dun would provide the greatest impact on the currently overcapacity Rose Hill. It would also bring the highest number of people within a 30-minute drive time catchment of a crematorium for the first time. Barnby Dun is now consented and is agreed to form a commitment. Therefore, some of the original need is now being, or will soon be, met by Barnby Dun. The issue now is what residual need is left, and does this site meet it? In order to assess the need for crematorium development, one must assess qualitative and quantitative need, which are interrelated. There are some points of agreement on the methodology for assessing these needs. One should look at the practical core capacity in the peak month. This means taking the total number of cremation slots available in a calendar year, and it is agreed that 1 hour slots are the ideal, but that the ICCM Charter for the Bereaved advocates for a 40 to 45 minute minimum. From there, one takes the core slots as those between, and this is a correction, ma'am, from the version you have, as those between 9:30 to 3:30 or 10 AM to 4 PM on Dignity's case. Then take the number of cremations undertaken in the last calendar year minus the direct cremations. Take the average number of monthly cremations from that figure, and finally divide the calculated peak month cremations by the average monthly core slots. Straightforward when you say it out loud. This gives the figure for the practical core capacity in the peak month. Operating above 80% practical core capacity in the peak month makes it more difficult to deliver a qualitatively acceptable service. For example, this may mean that time slots have to be reduced or waiting times increased. When this calculation is done based upon actual cremation data, i.e. how many cremations a facility undertook in a calendar year, then it can be used as an assessment of actual performance. However, when it is used to assess need and the impact of a development on need, then there is a degree of calculation that is required. This includes calculating the catchment area of the crematorium and the number of annual deaths within it. The natural catchment area, or minimum distance catchment, is an unconstrained catchment area for a crematorium that assumes people will always go to the closest one. It is this that is used in the calculations on need within the evidence produced by all parties. Applying a cremation rate to the number of deaths to get the number of cremations within the catchment. Mr. Mitchell in his evidence urged a cautious approach of an 80% cremation rate, but accepted in cross-examination that it could go to 85% by 2034, the year to which the figures are being projected. However, it is open to you, ma'am, to reach your own conclusions on this. And it is worth noting that the basis on which Mr. Best reaches his 85% seems to require constant and predictable year-on-year growth, which does not allow for slowing as the maximum cremation rate is reached. It being accepted that there will never be over 100% cremation rate, nor obviously could there be more than 100%, which Mr. Best's method would imply. Deducting the number of direct cremations from that number of from the number of overall cremations, and Mr. Mitchell argued that on the current trend, 20% of cremations being direct cremations within the next 5 years is a realistic assumption, and this accords with the practical experience of Mr. Hodgson, whose business works within the direct cremation market. Not every funeral within the MDC of a crematorium will use that facility. People will choose other facilities for a host of reasons: previous family funerals, proximity to other family members, availability of preferred times. This was accepted as a point of principle by all parties. However, what is not accepted is how one factors this principle into the calculations, or indeed if one should attempt to factor in such speculation into calculations at all, to rebalance or not to rebalance. Both Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Mitchell take a straightforward approach to this issue. There is ebb and flow across the boundaries of the MDC for every crematorium for a host of reasons. This is the market. No crematorium takes 100% of the cremations within its MDC. Any attempt at forecasting that ebb and flow is little more than guesswork. What one should do is recognise that when one forecasts or models the number of cremations a crematorium will do from its MDC, accept that it is not an exact science. It is a tool to assist decision making, whether that be for planning decisions or business planning. It is a good indicator of the number of cremations that one might reasonably expect a crematorium to undertake, and the number that it may take from existing crematoria, but it is not precise. Seeking that degree of precision, as Mr. Best does through his rebalancing, is no more than finger in the air guesswork. It also runs the risk of appearing to be an attempt at puffing up the figures because, and there's no surprise here, rebalancing only went in favour of Mr. Best's client's application. In cross-examination of Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Village put his case very high indeed, that it was akin to a requirement to undertake a rebalancing exercise, and that a failure to do so was a serious error on Mr. Mitchell's part. This is, with respect, a totally misguided argument. There is no policy or guidance that says rebalancing must be done. In the appeal decision where Mr. Best undertook a rebalancing exercise, and the reference there, Ma'am, is to the Wergs appeal decision, which you'll recall we spent some time in, he proposed that the new crematorium would take 50% of the cremations within the fringe catchment outside the MDC. And the inspector described the approach as little more than an educated guess. There is nothing in the Secretary of State's letter that takes it any further than the inspector's conclusions. In fact, the figures produced without rebalancing are arguably more reliable and less likely to be infected by attempts to skew figures to suit an argument. Mr. Best, in examination in chief, himself stated about rebalancing, and this is a direct quote from his evidence, "It is assumed that everyone within a catchment area is going to go to the nearest. Plainly, that won't happen in every case. There will be flows either way. It is impossible to model and therefore assume they are neutral." In his proof at paragraph 10.49, he says that it is impossible to accurately forecast crematorium choices using anything other than convenience. The CMA report, a very detailed study into the cremation market, pulled no punches when casting doubt on the extent to which out of area beyond the MDC customers are attracted to private crematoria. They found that there is a tendency among the private operators, including the appellant, to overstate the extent to which they compete for out of area customers. They found that flows across MDC boundaries go both ways, and that there is a marginal ability to attract out of area customers on the basis of quality and price. That there are a number of reasons why people choose an out of area facility, and that the quote proportions of private crematoria customers who are from out of area varies widely, and this is the case regardless of whether the nearest rival is a local authority crematorium or another private crematorium. The overall conclusion of the CMA on this point was abundantly clear. In view of the arguments that private crematoria have put forward about their quality being higher than that of local authority crematoria, we might expect that private crematoria may attract higher proportions of out-of-area customers when their nearest rival is a local authority crematorium. However, we do not find this to be the case. There is no support for the quasi-mathematical rebalancing of Mr. Best from the CMA or from the Wergs appeal. Even Mr. Best, in his written and oral evidence, accepts that it is impossible to accurately forecast these points. Nonetheless, in the absence of any policy support or support from the Secretary of State or from the CMA, Mr. Best ploughed on with rebalancing, and Mr. Village put the points forcefully to Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Hodgson that this was a serious oversight not to have rebalanced. Mr. Best attempts to forecast on the basis of quality and price, discounted as marginal drivers for out-of-area choice by the CMA. He assumes 100% of the catchment area will go to the appellant's scheme, and then he adds 30% to that figure. The origin of the 30% figure is the appellant's research that in over 30% of cases, the chosen crematorium was not the closest to the house of the deceased. There is no clarity on the robustness of this research. This was research submitted to the CMA and assessed as tending to overstate the position. The westerly research, also scorned by the CMA, suggested 20 to 30%. When choosing which figure to take for his rebalancing, there is no sense of caution from Mr. Best. He unsurprisingly goes for the highest figure of 30%, the top of the range. Why isn't that surprising? Well, ma'am, one only needs to look at the outcome of his exercise at table 10.13 of his proof. In the column for scenario 3, once Mr. Best has waved his statistical wand, lo and behold, the development has a greater impact on the overtrading at Barnsley, Pontefract and Rotherham, the Western Arc facilities, and less of an impact on Rose Hill and Barnby Dun. Mr. Best's specious statistical system amplifies his client's case. It shows that the impact on the Western Arc is greater than before. So just as the appellant's case has pivoted from being all about Rose Hill at application stage to the Western Arc at appeal, so does the need assessment. It is totally contrived. In addition, Mr. Best accepted that he had not performed any rebalancing when assessing the impact of the other new and high quality facilities to the south in Babworth and Barnby Moor. Surely, if rebalancing is so essential, then it must be applied to all new facilities that Mr. Best accepted were of high quality, or is it just to the one being promoted at the appeal? Finally, Mr. Best was clear in cross-examination that despite him being involved in the production of the needs statement for the application and providing comments on it, he did not even request that a rebalancing exercise was undertaken. Again, an exercise which he now considers to be essential. Drawing that together, Ma'am, rebalancing has no basis in policy, guidance or appeal decisions. It is agreed by all parties to be an impossible task to forecast such rebalancing and has been called little more than an educated guess by an inspector. And it appears only to be applied when it suits Mr. Best and his client. For all of these reasons, the rebalancing exercise should be totally discounted. Instead, Ma'am, we urge you to adopt the approach agreed by Mr. Williams in cross-examination when determining the weight to be attached to the need, identify the level of need, and then assess the proposal's ability to meet it, whether the proposal is best located to meet that need. This is the approach undertaken in numerous of the other appeal decisions without any need for rebalancing. There are points of disagreement on the detail going into the calculations, for example, the cremation rates and the percentage of direct cremations addressed above. However, when it comes down to the outturn of the calculations, in reality, there is little between the parties. Ma'am, this may come as no surprise, as the inspector in the Works appeal noted that assessing current and future use of a crematorium is not an exact science. What is common to the analysis of all three witnesses on need is that once Barnby Dun is constructed and fully operational, then the quantitative and qualitative need issues at Rosehill Crematorium are addressed. Ma'am, there's the figures given by Mr. Best and Mr. Hodgson are provided there. Mr. Mitchell, taking into account the effect of Barnby Dun and the two Retford crematoria becoming fully operational, projects capacity at Rosehill to 2034 at 68.1%, again underneath the 80% threshold. This is the baseline position without Brodsworth in place. Rosehill is operating within its capacity with no limitations on providing a quality service. The position, Ma'am, on the Western Arc is not so rosy. Ma'am, for ease of reference, I hope, or for your ease of reference, there in the table is Mr. Best, Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Mitchell's conclusions on the level of performance at the three Western Arc crematoria without the Brodsworth scheme being in place. All of the Western Arc facilities are overtrading at the baseline position, and that's 2034 in Mr. Best and Mr. Hodgson's assessment and modelled on actual cremations in Mr. Mitchell's. If the appeal scheme is built out, Ma'am, and those again drawing together the evidence of Mr. Best, Mr. Hodgson and Mr. Mitchell, the effect upon the three Western Arc crematoria for ease of reference. The effect of the development on the Western Arc, the supposed target market and the reformulated case is minimal. As a result of the appeal scheme, none of the Western Arc crematoria are reduced to below the 80% capacity point. The development does not enable any of the Western Arc crematoria to make any qualitative improvements. The point put to Mr. Mitchell was that this doesn't matter because the reductions in overtrading are still, on the appellant's calculations only, and as put to Mr. Mitchell, significant. Mr. Mitchell accepted this in cross-examination, but only on the narrow basis put to him. In the rest of his evidence, Mr. Mitchell considered the issue of need more broadly, as you must do, Ma'am. There is plainly a need for relief on the overcapacity facilities in the Western Arc. That is plain on any of the calculations submitted to the inquiry. The next step, as agreed to by Mr. Williams, is to assess the impact of this scheme has on relieving that overcapacity. In other words, on meeting that need. The only sensible conclusion on that basis is that the development makes no meaningful contribution to meeting it. The reason for that is obvious. It is because this site was promoted from the outset to relieve overtrading and meet the need associated with that at Rosehill. The site search area, commissioned by the appellant, only covers the north of Doncaster. There was no search done to target the need in the Western Arc. All that has happened is that the appellant has attempted to repurpose their case post-refusal and post the approval of Barnby Dunn. The cross-examination of Ms Suddies was put on the basis that there is no policy requirement for alternative site assessment. It was an exciting but ultimately pointless line of questioning from Mr Village, and unfortunately it was not grounded in his client's case. Whilst there is nothing in the framework or the local plan that requires an alternative site assessment for development management purposes, the framework at paragraph 141 sets out that at strategic policy level, that all other reasonable options for meeting identified need for development should be explored as opposed to simply taking land out of the green belt. An ASA was requested in the pre-app, and an ASA was done by the appellant, and evidence has been produced by the appellant, including an ASA, or their version of an ASA. Mr Williams could not be more clear in his proof of evidence that as part of the very special circumstances case, it is appropriate to consider whether there are alternative preferable sites available to accommodate the development within the catchment area it will serve. The end of that sentence is important. Within the catchment area it will serve. The appellant's case to you, ma'am, is that this development will serve a catchment in the Western Arc, and yet no search has been done with a main focus of that catchment area. Mr Williams confessed in cross-examination to not looking for any better sites further to the west. It will no doubt be put in closing, as it was in cross-examination, that this doesn't matter because the scheme is meeting some need. This ignores a fundamental and accepted point. There may be alternative sites that can better meet the need of the Western Arc. That alternative site or sites may be outside the Greenbelt and therefore be preferable. As has been seen in this inquiry, when new crematoria are proposed, its impact on the existing crematoria is hotly contested. It is not known what effect this proposed development will have in restricting the location of future sites. These questions could and should have been answered by a proper ASA that was focused on the Western Arc, the catchment area the development will serve, or we're told that the development will serve. Consenting this scheme in the Greenbelt requires, ma'am, that you be satisfied that it is the best site to meet the need of the Western Arc and that there are no reasonable alternatives. It is for the appellant to meet that, and it has comprehensively failed to do so. The appeal site is not best located to meet the need of the Western Arc, as it was never intended to do so. This must, as Mr Williams accepts, impact the weight that can be given to the need case. Only moderate weight should be attached. In addition, there would be a disproportionate impact on Rose Hill, which must weigh against the scheme. The case allegedly supported by Mr Best's analysis that the proposal meets the needs of the Western Arc is not made out. Interestingly, when Mr Williams comes to the planning balance and to consider the social objective, the need case, his focus is not on the Western Arc, but on travel times and reducing travel times of people to a crematorium to within 45 minutes. In cross-examination, Mr Best conceded that this was not part of his case. From the evidence of Mr Mitchell, the appeal scheme would bring only 2,148 people within a 30-minute drive time of a crematorium for the first time. 84.4% of Doncaster residents currently live within a 30-minute drive time of a crematorium. Barnby Dunn will increase this to 94.9%. Brodsworth would only increase the percentage to 95.2%, an increase of only 0.3%. It isn't clear whether the drive time assessment in Mr Williams's proof is an alternative to the Western Arc need case, or whether it runs alongside it. Either way, like the Western Arc need case, it is a weak one and does not result in any additional positive weight in favour of the scheme. Of the other benefits proposed, no weight should be given to public access to the site. The proposal is not easily accessed other than by private car. There is no footpath to the site, and there is no footpath along the access road. There is no nearby public transport. Other than it being difficult to access unless attending a service, it is highly unlikely that many people will access the site other than to attend one. I'm not sure that sentence makes sense. The point being that people are not likely to use it as a recreational space and only use the site to attend a service. Significant weight should be given to the biodiversity net gain, although where non-native or locally characteristic ornamental species are proposed and disturbance by people is present, the benefits will be less. And limited weight should be given to the economic benefits as they are only slight. Against that, ma'am, substantial weight must be given to each of the harms to the greenbelt, the harm by reason of inappropriateness, the harm to the openness, and the harm to the permanence of the greenbelt, and the encroachment into the countryside. It is accepted, as it must be, that it is substantial weight to the level of harm. So, for example, substantial weight to the minor harm in visual terms, but the weight is substantial nonetheless. This is a site that causes multiple harms to the greenbelt, and taken together it must amount to a very substantial weight against the proposal. There is also the landscape and visual harm. Whilst it is not a standalone reason for refusal, and it has never been proposed as such by the council, it is agreed that this harm cannot simply be ignored. It must be weighed in the balance. The proposal is in conflict with Policy 33, and it does not conserve or enhance the landscape. Significant weight must be attached to this harm. In conclusion, ma'am, this is a site that does not meet the test of the appellant's own planning witness. They have not shown that it is in the best location to meet the needs for the Western Arc. It is a repurposed case that has failed. Perhaps a proper alternative site assessment, conducted after the consent was granted to Barnby Dun, may have yielded more appropriate sites, better able to meet the needs of the Western Arc. We cannot say. The appellant has failed to show that the benefits of the scheme clearly outweigh the harm to the greenbelt and any other harm, and as a result, ma'am, the appeal should be dismissed. Ma'am, unless there are any questions, those are the submissions on behalf of the local planning authority.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. Just in terms of for clarity's sake, in terms of the tables included after paragraph 48, I mean, paragraph 49 states all of the Western Arc facilities are overtraining at the baseline position. So that table above paragraph 49 is the baseline position without the appeal proposal 2034 in JB and JH assessment. In terms of the PM assessment, it's modelled on actual cremations in the PM assessment, but is that at
It's the use of the 2019 data, ma'am, that Mr. Mitchell used for his calculations, and that the footnotes there next to the name of the witness. So JB, Mr. Best is his table 10.4, Mr. Hodgson is his table on page 17, and Mr. Mitchell is his figure 21.
Okay, so that's at 2019 in terms
yes,
of...
that's right. It was, and you'll recall there was, and no doubt we'll hear about it in a moment, questions about the use of the actual data versus the forecasting calculations used by the approach from Mr. Best and Mr. Hodgson.
Okay, thank you. And therefore the same applies in the next table, but with the proposed development factored in. Yeah.
It was simply hopefully to assist in terms of the conclusions of the relevant three experts.
Okay, that's a useful clarification. Thank you very much, Mr. Robson, for your closing submissions. Just in terms of timescales, it probably is worth breaking for lunch, unless Mr. Village, you're ready to roll with your closing submissions.
I'm just making a few small amendments to pick up some of the more tendentious points of my learned friends. So I think I might take lunch to do that, as well as having something to eat because my stomach is starting to rumble. But I mean, I'm going to be within the time estimate of, I think I said about an hour, and that's what it will be.
Okay, thank you. Well, if we adjourn for lunch and return at 20 to 2, does that sound acceptable? We've got an earlier finish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, can I just raise one other thing, and that is that, and I told Mr. Robson this, but you may have been wondering. We did at one stage suggest that we might make an application for costs against the council in relation to the late evidence, and we've reconsidered our position about that. And I mean, undoubtedly, the council's position was manifestly unreasonable in bringing that evidence in so late. But in terms that, because in fact, in a sense, because it was so late, it gave us very little time to spend on it, and to actually divorce the time that we spent on it with all the other time we were spending on the inquiry would be very difficult for us to demonstrate that we'd incurred expense unnecessarily. So the council have been able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps in that respect and avoid our application for costs.
Okay, Mr.
Perverse as that may sound.
Taking a pragmatic view, fair to say. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Village. So we shall adjourn the inquiry until 20 to 2. Thank you very much.